Around 650 before our era, anyone living between the Mediterranean and the Iranian plateau knew the same fear. It did not matter if you were a shepherd in the Zagros Mountains, a priest in the temples of Babylon, or a farmer on the plains of the Levant. Everyone knew what happened when Assyria marched. Entire cities were emptied. Populations ripped from their lands and resettled in distant territories, among languages they did not understand, and climates their bodies did not recognize. Those who resisted faced something worse. Bodies impaled on stakes lined along the roads, severed heads stacked in pyramids before the gates of conquered cities, the skins of rebel leaders flayed and nailed to walls as tapestries of warning. And at the center of all of this, at the beating heart of this machine of domination, stood the largest city the ancient world had ever known. Its name was Nineveh. To understand the magnitude of what Nineveh represented, one must abandon any image of a primitive metropolis hidden among deserts. Nineveh, around the 7th century before our era, was a marvel of engineering, administration, and concentrated power that had no equivalent anywhere on the planet. The city stretched along the eastern bank of the Tigris River in northern Mesopotamia, protected by walls 12 kilometers in length, enclosing an area of 750 hectares. 18 monumental gates gave access to the interior, and at each of them, colossal figures of winged bulls with human heads, carved from blocks of gypsum alabaster, guarded the entrance. The Assyrians called them Lamassu and believed they prevented malevolent forces from crossing the city's boundaries. With over 100,000 inhabitants, Nineveh was the largest concentration of people in the world during that period, a population no other city came close to matching. The city was fed by an irrigation system that would not be surpassed in scale and sophistication for more than 500 years. The architect of this transformation was King Sennacherib, who ruled between 705 and 681 before our era. When he transferred the Assyrian capital to Nineveh, he did not merely move the seat of government. He rebuilt the entire city. Streets were widened and paved, public squares were opened, temples dedicated to Sin, Shamash, Ishtar, Nabu, and Nergal were raised or restored. But Sennacherib's most ambitious project was what he himself called the Palace Without Rival, a structure of at least 80 rooms whose approximate dimensions were 180 by 190 meters. Its walls were lined with stone bas reliefs that, if placed end to end, would stretch nearly 3 kilometers. These reliefs depicted military campaigns across the Near East with documentary precision. Cities under siege, walls being scaled, populations deported in long columns, prisoners kneeling before the Assyrian king. They were not decoration, they were calculated propaganda, designed to intimidate any ambassador, vassal ruler, or potential rebel who walked those corridors. Each relief communicated a single message: rebellion costs more than you can bear to pay. Sennacherib commissioned gardens that rivaled anything the ancient world had produced. Terraced gardens were designed to replicate the Amanus Mountains in southeastern Anatolia, and sheltered aromatic plants and fruit trees brought from every corner of the empire. Outside the walls, botanical gardens gathered plant species from regions as distant as Chaldea and the Hittite lands. Game reserves housed wild boar, deer, and lions. Some modern historians propose that these gardens, not the ones supposedly built by Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon, were the true hanging gardens of antiquity, but Sennacherib's most impressive feat of engineering lay outside the city walls. To supply Nineveh and its gardens with sufficient water, he ordered the construction of a canal network totaling more than 150 kilometers in length, executed in 4 phases between 702 and 688 before our era. The system captured water from rivers and streams in the northern mountains and channeled it to the Nineveh plain through canals carved into limestone bedrock, equipped with steps and walkways for cleaning and maintenance. Secondary canals branched from the main channels to irrigate all surrounding agricultural fields. The most spectacular element of this network was the aqueduct at Jerwan, a structure 280 meters long, built with more than 2 million precisely cut limestone blocks joined with waterproof cement. This aqueduct crossed a deep valley on stone arches, anticipating by 5 centuries the techniques the Romans would later make famous. An inscription carved into the blocks themselves declared, "Sennacherib, king of the world, king of Assyria. Over a great distance I directed a watercourse to the environs of Nineveh, joining together the waters. Over steep-sided valleys I spanned an aqueduct of white limestone blocks and made those waters flow over it." The system transformed the fields around the capital into areas of intensive irrigated agriculture, replacing rainfall-dependent cultivation with controlled production, capable of feeding the growing population and sustaining gardens of almost paradisiac fertility. Popular imagination tends to portray Assyria as an exclusively military civilization, a war machine with no intellectual dimension. The archaeological record tells a more complex story. Ashurbanipal, the last great king of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, who ruled from 668 to approximately 631 before our era, was simultaneously one of the most lethal and most learned monarchs of the ancient world. He was personally literate in an age when most kings relied entirely on their scribes. He mastered both Akkadian and Sumerian and had been trained in the scribal arts from youth. A preserved inscription records his own words. "I, Ashurbanipal, absorbed the wisdom of Nabu, becoming proficient in the entire art of writing on clay tablets." Ashurbanipal conceived and executed what may be considered the first systematic project of universal knowledge preservation in human history. He dispatched scribes and emissaries throughout the empire with specific orders to copy and send to Nineveh every text they could find. Clay tablets covered in cuneiform writing arrived from temples, palaces, and scribal schools in Babylon, Sippar, Borsippa, and dozens of other centers of learning. Babylonian scribes were captured during military campaigns and forced to work in the royal libraries, copying and cataloging texts. The result was a collection of more than 30,000 tablets and fragments covering medicine, astronomy, mathematics, literature, religious rituals, divination texts, lexical lists, legal treaties, diplomatic correspondence, and historical records. Among these tablets was the Epic of Gilgamesh, the oldest narrative work in human literature, originally composed in Sumerian millennia earlier. The library was organized by subject, each tablet identified by colophons indicating its content, origin, and position in the sequence. There was a general catalogue and possibly catalogues by category. A specific official was responsible for the custody of the collection. The library of Ashurbanipal was not a mere government archive. It was a deliberate repository of all knowledge accumulated by Mesopotamian civilization over 3 millennia. Nineveh was therefore a city of extraordinary contradictions. Within its walls coexisted the most exquisite botanical gardens alongside game reserves teeming with wild animals, the greatest library of the ancient world, next to reliefs celebrating impalements and decapitations in explicit detail. Broad avenues where chariots circulated between temples and palaces, fed by a hydraulic system that anticipated Roman engineering. A city where the accumulated knowledge of millennia was catalogued and preserved by order of a king who, in the same decade, had ordered the royal tombs of Elam opened and the bones of dead kings deported as war trophies. Terror and sophistication were not opposing forces within the Assyrian Empire. They were complementary faces of the same power structure. That structure, however, contained a fundamental vulnerability that its builders did not perceive or chose to ignore. The Assyrian Empire had been built almost exclusively on military superiority. It offered conquered peoples nothing beyond the negative benefit of not being destroyed. There was no Assyrian cultural model that subjugated populations wanted to adopt voluntarily. There was no economic system that made vassal territories prosper. The empire was held together by force and the memory of force. The policy of mass deportation was effective in the short term. Displaced populations, separated from their lands and social structures, had little capacity to organize resistance. Artisans, scribes, and skilled workers were removed from their communities and resettled wherever the empire needed them most. Assyrian records tally deportations of tens of thousands of people at a time. But each deportation created a displaced and resentful population with no loyalty to Assyria, ready to support any viable alternative the instant one appeared. Each impalement and each pile of severed heads did not merely intimidate, it fed a hatred that accumulated silently on the empire's peripheries. Assyria had deliberately destroyed the traditional structures that might have provided local stability in conquered territories, but offered nothing in their place beyond imperial administration and fear. Terror was a sophisticated political tool. But political tools have consequences that compound. Ashurbanipal's own military successes accelerated the problem. In 652 before our era, his half-brother Shamash-shum-ukin, who governed Babylon as a vassal, revolted with the support of Elamite kings. The civil war that followed lasted 4 years. Ashurbanipal besieged Babylon until famine forced its surrender in 648. Shamash-shum-ukin may have died by setting fire to his own palace. Ashurbanipal then turned against Elam with a ferocity that surprised even Assyrian standards. The Elamite capital, Susa, was captured and completely razed. Temples were looted, the population massacred or deported, and Ashurbanipal ordered salt sown over the devastated land, and the royal tombs opened so that the bones of Elamite kings could be deported as captives. Edomite prisoners were brought to Nineveh, tortured, and publicly humiliated. The royal inscriptions record every detail with calculated pride. Elam was turned into a political wasteland, but these victories came at a cost that the palace reliefs did not record. The army was exhausted from simultaneous campaigns on 3 fronts. The treasury was drained. Devastated colonies no longer produced enough tribute to sustain the imperial machine. And with each enemy eliminated, new adversaries calculated their chances. The Assyrian chronicles break off abruptly after 639 before our era. Business records disappear after 631. Around that year, Ashurbanipal died, and with his death, the edifice began to crumble from within. His sons, Ashur-etil-ilani and Sin-shar-ishkun, inherited an empire already fracturing. Civil wars over the succession erupted almost immediately. Ruins excavated at Nineveh dating to the period just after Ashurbanipal's death show burn marks, suggesting that internal violence reached the capital itself. The general Sin-shumu-lishir attempted a coup. Revolts flared in the provinces. With each month of instability, vassal peoples watched, calculated, and prepared. The first to act was Nabopolassar, a Chaldean leader who seized control of Babylon around 626 before our era and founded what historians call the Neo-Babylonian Empire. He needed 10 years of fighting to completely expel Assyrian garrisons from Babylonian territory, but his ambition extended far beyond regional independence. The declared objective was to destroy the Assyrian capitals and transfer the center of Mesopotamian power back to Babylon for the first time in over 1,000 years. Nabopolassar, however, was pragmatic enough to recognize that he could not defeat Assyria alone. The Assyrian military machine, even weakened by civil wars, remained formidable. He needed allies, and he found them in the mountains of the Iranian plateau. Cyaxares, king of the Medes, had been initially defeated by the Assyrians, but he reorganized his army and was willing to join any force capable of destroying the power that had humiliated his people. The alliance was sealed, according to the Babylonian historian Berossus, with a dynastic marriage. The Babylonian crown prince Nebuchadnezzar married a Median princess. Scythians, Cimmerians, Lydians, and Aramaeans also joined the coalition. Each of these peoples carried decades or centuries of accumulated resentment. Assyria, which for generations had terrorized each of them individually, would now face them united. In 614 before our era, the Medes attacked Ashur, the ancient religious capital of Assyria, and sacked it before the Babylonian army even arrived. The temples were destroyed. The city that gave its name to the people, the god and the empire, was reduced to rubble. Nabopolassar arrived too late to participate in the sacking, but signed the formal treaty with Cyaxares there. From that point on, Nineveh was the final target. In May of 612 before our era, the combined armies of the Medes and Babylonians crossed the Tigris and encamped before the walls of Nineveh. A siege began that would last 3 months. The walls Sennacherib had built were formidable, between 12 and 15 meters high, reinforced with towers and protected by a moat, 45 meters wide, fed by the Kosa River. The besiegers' battering rams could not penetrate them. The initial strategy was to starve the city into submission, but nature intervened in a way that the defenders had not foreseen and that their own engineers had made possible. Torrential rains swelled the Kosa River. The waters dammed in the canals and reservoirs that Sennacherib had built to feed his gardens, and fields turned against the city. The sluices gave way. Water invaded the foundations of the walls and brought down an extensive stretch of the defenses. The impregnable fortress had been breached from within. The invading armies poured through the gap. The fighting became house-to-house combat through the streets of Nineveh. Archaeological excavations conducted at the Halsey Gate uncovered skeletons of defenders fallen directly in the gateway passage, some still armed, lying unburied on the pavement. The violence had been too swift to allow even the most basic funeral rites. Hundreds of iron arrowheads were found scattered among shattered pottery and collapsed masonry, evidence of close-quarters combat at one of the city's most fortified points. King Sinshar-Ishkun died during the siege. A tradition recorded by Diodorus of Sicily claims that he built an immense funeral pyre inside the royal palace, placed upon it his gold, his silver, and his royal robes, and immolated himself together with his wives and concubines. The temples were systematically looted, the palaces set ablaze. The pillaging of the city continued until mid-August, when the Medes finally departed for home, carrying immense quantities of plunder in precious metals and cult objects. The news shocked the ancient world. From distant Greece, the poet Phocylides of Miletus recorded a lesson. A small city, well organized on a steep promontory, is stronger than foolish Nineveh. The Hebrew prophet Nahum, who had foretold the city's destruction, described armies advancing with red shields and warriors clad in scarlet, flashing chariots and brandished pine spears. The population of Nineveh that could not escape to the last Assyrian strongholds was massacred or deported into the countryside, where they founded small scattered settlements. The conquerors did to the Assyrians exactly what the Assyrians had done to dozens of other peoples for centuries. Ashur-uballit II, possibly a relative of the royal family, managed to escape and established a final capital at Haran in Syria. He received military support from Egyptian Pharaoh Necho II. But in 609, Haran fell. In 605, at the Battle of Carchemish, the last remnants of the Assyrian army were crushed. The empire vanished. Before long, all the royal palaces lay in ruins beneath drifting sands, and even the most powerful kings were forgotten. There is a paradox in this destruction that deserves careful attention. The fire that consumed the palaces also preserved the library. Ashurbanipal's clay tablets, which under normal conditions would have degraded or been dispersed over the centuries, were fired by the blaze that destroyed the city, becoming hard enough to survive millennia. The collapse of roofs and walls sealed them under layers of debris, protecting them from looters and the elements. What appeared to be the definitive end of Ashurbanipal's legacy turned out to be the mechanism of its preservation. When the British archaeologist Austen Henry Layard excavated Nineveh in the mid-19th century, he unearthed not merely the remains of a destroyed city, but the key to deciphering entire civilizations that had been forgotten. In 1872, George Smith translated from these tablets the story of a great flood that predated the biblical narrative of Noah by centuries, revealing that the Hebrew tradition was heir to far more ancient Mesopotamian myths. The discovery shattered certainties that had seemed unshakable and provoked a revolution in the understanding of human history. The very flames that annihilated the Assyrian Empire created a time capsule. Nineveh remained a field of ruins for more than 2,500 years. The city that had been the largest in the world was so completely erased that for centuries scholars doubted it had ever existed. Today its ruins lie beneath the modern city of Mosul in northern Iraq. In 2015, militants of the Islamic State destroyed with sledgehammers Assyrian artifacts in the Mosul Museum that had survived 26 centuries. The winged bulls that guarded the gates were smashed to pieces. The destruction of Nineveh, it seems, has not yet ended. The fall of Nineveh exposes a pattern that repeats throughout history with a regularity that should disturb us. Empires built exclusively on the capacity to inflict fear create, in every person terrorized, a potential celebrant of their downfall. Every deported population becomes a latent enemy. Every demonstration of cruelty, recorded with pride on palace walls, feeds the coalition that will one day form. Assyria was the first great empire to demonstrate that a power organized entirely around military effectiveness can dominate its era. It was also the first to demonstrate that such a power creates the exact conditions for its own destruction. The Persians who came after adopted Assyrian administrative techniques but rejected the terror. The Romans used brutality selectively but offered conquered peoples participation in their culture and citizenship. The question Nineveh forces us to ask is not only about the past, it is about any structure of power that confuses forced obedience with genuine loyalty, that transforms fear into state policy, and that documents its own cruelty with pride. Does this sound like ancient history, or does it resonate with an uncomfortable familiarity? I am Tim, watching the past so that we may understand the present. And together, we keep history coming alive. See you in the next era.